My name is Jacqueline Rabe Thomas, and I'll be moderating tonight's session of Two Connecticuts, Conversations about Race and Place. I'm a reporter with Connecticut Public's Accountability Project, and I was formerly a reporter at the Connecticut Mirror. First, a big thank you to our sponsors who made this series possible: the University of Hartford's President's College, its lifelong learning program at the Office of Diversity and Community Engagement, the Third Age Initiative, a program of leadership Greater Hartford, and the Connecticut Mirror News Organization. Also, a special thank you to the members of the University of Hartford staff and several departments who gave their time and talents for this series. And thank you to you all in the audience, as well as those who are listening online. Over 800 people have registered to watch online. We're so glad you all are here. And please remember, if you haven't done so already, to sign up for the 2 remaining sessions. The next one will be on education, and then the final one will be on regionalization. You can register for those by going to the University of Hartford's website, and under the community conversations, you can register there. Tonight's program is also being offered virtually and is being recorded. The recordings will become available on the website of Leadership Greater Hartford and the University of Hartford's Office of Diversity and Community Engagement. We will take questions from both our in-person and virtual audiences. Our virtual audience, you can type your questions into the Q&A button. And for our in-person audience, you should have received index cards on your way in. If you haven't, they're right outside the door there, or someone can maybe come around and provide some. And I will be announcing later in the program for you to raise them in the air, and someone will come around and collect them. And now for tonight's program. Why are we here? We call it the Two Connecticuts because our state has 2 very distinct sub-societies: poor people living in our core cities and those who are living in the suburbs who are overwhelmingly white. The purpose of tonight's discussion, the second in this series, is to talk about the intersection of housing and racism. A large part of why we have 2 Connecticuts is racism. Racism in the past and racism in the present. We hope you leave here tonight and subsequent sessions eager to learn more and become more active and work to better address the great disparities that our citizens suffer in our state. Tonight, I welcome 3 more to this conversation. The first, who is participating remotely, Sarah Bronin. She's an architect. First, Sarah Bronin, she's on Zoom. She's an architect, attorney, professor, and land use reform advocate. Her work focuses on law and policy and how it can foster a more equitable, sustainable, and well-sustained and connected place. She's a professor at Cornell College of Architecture, Art, and Planning. She's, among other projects, Bronin leads the research team behind the Connecticut Zoning Atlas, an interactive map of all the zoning regulations throughout the state. Her upcoming book, Key to the City, will explore how zoning shapes our lives. And now for our panelists on stage. Karen DuBois Walton is the president of Elm City Communities Housing Authority at the City of New Haven, and she's the president of the Glendower Group, LLC, and 360 Management Group, the property management affiliate. She's responsible for administrative, programmatic, and policy direction in New Haven of their housing authority, and she also oversees their public housing, Section 8, their voucher choice program, and the finance and planning of development. Jim Pereira is an attorney and lobbyist and has been the chief executive officer of the Home Builders and Remodelers Association of Connecticut since May of 2018. His work, along with his prior experience in the Connecticut Legislative Office and a governmental liaison for several state agencies, informs his work. Sorry about that. He has given testimony at legislative hearings and written several articles for the need for statewide reforms in order to create a more affordable and just housing in Connecticut. Okay, and so let's start with the questions. Uh-oh, my screen's not sharing anymore. I don't have screen. All right, well, we'll do with this one. No, you are not on screen, Sarah. So we'll start with this one. So this is about home ownership. The Connecticut, as well as around the country, has gaping and yawning disparities in who owns homes. In Connecticut, we have the second largest gap between its white and Latinx residents, the largest gap between mixed race and white residents, and the 15th largest gap between Black and white residents. And the gap is not budging, as you'll see here on this chart. First question is for Karen. What do you feel has contributed to those glaring gaps? And when it comes to state and federal funding for affordable housing, is that focused more on building rental units or home ownership opportunities? Essentially, are state resources and federal resources helping narrow these disparities?
So I have worked in the field of affordable housing for the past 15 years, and most of the federal. Thank you.
We're getting used to being back
Sorry
in
about
person.
that. Right. I know. Usually it's you got to unmute yourself. Now it's hold the mic. So I've worked in affordable housing for the past 15 years through the major federally funded programs. And working in public housing and the Housing Choice Voucher programs that are referred to often as Section 8 programs. We do our work with a keen awareness of where we sit in the history of U.S. housing policy, and that what we see today around the gaps in home ownership rates, around the overrepresentation of Black and Latino and other families of color in urban centers, in rental housing, and you see disproportionately white families in suburban housing and in home ownership opportunities, is very clearly the result of what U.S. housing policy has been over the past 300 or so years. Housing policy that intentionally created opportunities for wealth creation, opportunities for home ownership in the suburban communities, that was specifically for white families, that explicitly blocked those opportunities for Black families. And this is a history that's been well documented. And at the same time, a history that created rental housing. Rental housing obviously is not a way of creating wealth. People earn no ownership in rental housing, and that housing has been in urban centers and significantly for Black and Latino and other families of color. And so what we see today in the wealth gap is very much connected to the differences in home ownership. It was something that was created intentionally, and that there have not been intentional efforts to undo in any way that significantly has closed that gap, as you can see over the years, that has continued to persist. And the incredible investments that happen around affordable housing are disproportionately still in rental housing. And we've not seen the kind of investment that went into creating suburbs, which was government subsidy into suburban development. We have not seen that kind of investment since the Fair Housing Act has really created the change where we can't do that just for white families anymore. But that same investment that went into creating suburbs has not been used to create homeownership opportunities for those that were shut out for so long. So we see persistent, longstanding, unchanging gaps in terms of who owns housing and who's in rental housing. And it remains very much race-based and very much connected to a racist and a discriminatory past.
The next question is for Jim. In certain communities, home ownership rates are extremely low, as Karen just mentioned. Could you talk a little bit about how developers decide what types of housing to build and where?
Thank you. Thank you. Everyone can hear me, right? Great. So I just first would like to say thank you for the invitation to be here today. I really do feel like I'm punching above my weight class here with this august panel. And certainly Jacqueline herself could be a panelist, right? We've all read her articles and they're really tremendous. And, you know, I think your work and the articles that you've published really colored the conversation, right? And certainly I know that the community of private developers that I represent read and really ingest the work that you do, and it is widely circulated amongst our community. So why is housing built in some places and not in others, right? So I guess that's a big question that we could really talk about all night long, right? But I will try to be as brief as possible. Certainly, Sarah can speak to zoning, right? And how zoning makes it easier to build in one location as opposed to another. But there are other reasons, right? As far as affordable housing goes, and Karen can speak to this much better than I can, but I will try to give a 30,000 foot view here. Historically, the feds, write a check to the states. The states, that check comes potentially with strings. And the state bonds money, uses its credit card to borrow money for affordable housing. And from time to time, we'll see that the state also will have a line item of appropriations in its budget. That only happens when times are good and the state has the capability of doing that. So what happens from there, right? The money is given to DOH and CHFA. They put out an RFP, and only a handful of companies will typically respond to that RFP, right? And those are potentially, or typically speaking, and I'm generalizing here, of course, either multi-state developer companies or nonprofits that have the aptitude and the wherewithal to navigate the state's bureaucracy and to adhere to the strings that are attached by HUD and other federal organizations. The result being that you don't find, private, mid-sized to smaller developers, private developers engaged in this space like we would like to see them engaged in this space. And primarily because these guys typically don't have attorneys on staff. They don't have the consultant that is needed to navigate the bureaucracy and red tape that comes along with the funding. And so then what you see is affordable housing done in areas that are already saturated with affordable housing, right? And so, certainly there are programs out there, and Karen, I'm sure we'll talk to them, that are shifting gears, if you will. But right now, I think that for the private sector, there's very little knowledge about how to navigate the state bureaucracy. And certainly we can talk about solutions to that moving forward. But
Gotcha. Speaking of the process you were just talking about developers and where they decide to apply for that state pot of money, there are many more developers who apply for funding through CHFA than there is money to hand out. And also there seems to be some trends about where developers actually end up building when state money is handed out. Sarah, I'd like to ask you a few questions about zoning and the role that zoning plays in developing where it gets developed. Before you get into that, a review in 2013 of zoning codes in every jurisdiction by the Connecticut Fair Housing Center found that 25 municipalities don't allow multifamily housing, and 95% of the land in Connecticut was zoned exclusively for single family zoning. You did a review almost a decade later, and could you just set the table for whether things had changed very much in that decade?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. To all of the hosts, the Connecticut Mayor of the University of Hartford, I should say first, and it's a pleasure to be on a panel with Jim and Karen and of course Jackie. So looking at the statewide zoning codes is a pretty big project, and we were able, through the good graces of many volunteers and research assistants, to go through 32,000 pages of zoning code text in 180 different jurisdictions in the state. And you think, well, why are there more than 169? And that's because there are sub-municipal jurisdictions with zoning powers. They're in Newtown, in Groton, in Guilford, Branford, and a couple of other towns as well. So you have this large number of zoning jurisdictions across the state, and we tied the zoning code information about where housing is allowed and what kind of housing and other restrictions on that housing, including minimum parking requirements and height requirements and lot coverage caps and minimum unit size even, and documented that with GIS data. And there's a map right there that shows that ultimately we found, by actually tying it to GIS data, a much more I guess, accurate number than had previously been done, which actually was pretty close to what the Fair Housing Center had done. But we found that 91% of land in Connecticut allows single-family housing as of right, versus 2% of Connecticut that allows 4 or more family housing as of right. So the image on the left, all that purple is where single-family housing is allowed. And then you can barely see on the right where multifamily housing is allowed as of right. And as of right now has a legal meaning. The last legislative session, the legislature actually adopted that term. And what it means is that this housing can be built without a bunch of onerous and very costly public hearing requirements. The community sets out rules about how that housing will be built in advance. And so that it helps developers have expectations. It helps the community meet their expectations of what they want to see in their neighborhood. And it really just permits the development of housing. We just don't see that kind of permitting across Connecticut. And that's really hindering our housing supply and driving up prices.
Karen, you've worked in this space. If I remember correctly, you have won some of the development money that the state has offered. Could you just talk a little bit about what that process is like and why you see certain developments, the role that zoning plays and where affordable housing is developed?
Sure. Again, I think it's important to keep this in the context of the history, right? So originally, as communities developed, there was a desire by residents of Connecticut to ensure that that people lived in places and not in other places, and that was very much driven by race. And there are things like covenants on housing deeds that is a part of Connecticut's history that said that when a house was sold, there were types of people it could be sold to, and there was explicitly people that it could not be sold to. So some housing deeds said, on selling this home, it cannot be sold to a Black person. It could not be sold to a Jewish person. So that is on the housing deed. That was on the housing deeds. When it became, with the passage of fair housing laws, and when those sorts of explicit things could not be done, zoning became the new way of controlling who lived where, who built where, what kind of housing was built. And so when it could no longer be as clear as saying, in this area, only white people can live, and in this area, Black people can live, zoning became the proxy by which land use decisions were made that kept that same sort of pattern in place. And it was and so, there's a way in which people can look at zoning laws and think that they are a-racist or non-racist, but they are rooted in trying to control land use decisions that were very much rooted in race and racism and discriminatory actions. And so when we see, I want to add to sort of why certain housing is built where it is, and what Jim was saying is also very much by what communities want and don't want. And you can see that that there are places where a proposal to build housing that is going to be housing that is affordable and therefore may attract more Black and Latino families because of all the things I talked about before. Black and Latino families are overrepresented in the lower income and therefore more apt to need rental housing and affordable housing. There are communities where a proposal for affordable housing will meet very little opposition, and those tend to be in your urban communities and in your communities where there's already affordable housing. And there are other communities where a proposal to build even a modest development will be fought tooth and nail at the town or city approval levels, at the planning and zoning level, at the town council level. And so that what communities want and the work to win over hearts and minds is as much a barrier to building because it's supporting these zoning maps and it's supporting the zoning decisions that are being made. So the work that's being done to make some changes includes work that has to happen at the state legislative level, because we have been a successful developer. We compete very successfully for the state money, for the tax credits that are coming into the state from the federal, and we use that to build affordable housing. And what we are doing is redeveloping the portfolio that exists for us in the city of New Haven. So we are creating high quality mixed income communities in New Haven, but we find it very difficult to use that same ability, that expertise and the resource in other communities, in places that badly need affordable housing development because of the zoning concerns and because of this community opposition that may come about. And so the efforts that need to be made at the state level certainly need to be big and bold efforts that are going to move forward the requirement that every community in our state carry their fair share of affordable housing. And it's going to be with enhancements and incentives, but it's also going to need to be with a push and with some consequences for not moving forward in that way. Because we see that incremental change has not moved the needle on those home ownership rates or on increasing the amount of affordable housing that we see in our communities.
Yeah. So Jim, I wanted to ask you about the role that the hot housing market is having right now, as well as zoning.
Sure, and I'm happy to answer that, but I would love to just piggyback on Karen's comments. Certainly, education is incredibly important, and we see that in the day-to-day life of any developer, that whether they be nonprofit or for-profit. And that goes to a question about process, right? So certainly zoning has been a way to stymie mixed use, affordable housing, et cetera. But process has too, and probably just as much and just as effectively, right? Sarah spoke earlier about the requirement for site plans and subdivision proposals, special permitting of things of that nature. And all those come with public hearings and opportunities for delay, opportunities to suffocate, if you or to basically delay. And so how do we get beyond that, right? And I love telling people about New Rochelle, right, as a case study in form-based codes. And I'm sure I'm probably stealing Sarah's thunder to a certain degree, but what New Rochelle has done is really remarkable, right? What they did is something that you would think would be absolutely intuitive, right? They started off, in the 90s and 2000s with very low development, affordable or otherwise. And in 2015, they all got together, the town that is, and said, how do we change that? How do we make New Rochelle more prosperous? Well, the developer community and the municipal officials all got together and said, let's educate the public, but not just educate the public. Let's engage the public, right? Here's a novel idea. Let's ask the public what they want and work backwards from there, right? And so they came up with an idea of a livable, walkable community that included all sorts of affordable housing opportunities, and so all those sort of accoutrements that come with a up and coming kind of community you would want in their community. And what they did was they created, form-based codes. And the downtown overlay is what they call it. And as a result, to sell this, and not to sell, but to also educate, they spent a whole year, educating the community, putting drop boxes in the community where folks could just put their ideas down about what they wanted their community to look like, how they wanted to live in their community, and how they wanted folks to invest in their community. And then they had public hearing after public hearing after public hearing. And what they came up with was, what New Rochelle is today. They came up with a form-based code that increased development exponentially. And within 3 years, they had 31 major new projects, and all including affordable housing elements. And so, I would say look to New Rochelle, right? If we want to build a more affordable housing, we want to engage the community, we want to educate the community, and we want the community to come back and say, yes, we want affordable housing and everything else that comes with it. Then do what they do and educate the community and engage the community. And, I think that sort of success can be replicated elsewhere.
So thank you for that. A question for Sarah. There's a lot of talk about affordable housing. Is affordable housing the same thing as fair housing? If you build more, can we build and zone our way into the ending of housing discrimination in our state? Or how much will zoning actually solve that issue?
Yeah, so thanks again for that question. I did want to just jump and just get from something that Jim just said about education. I do think that's critically important before I answer this question. And just to say that what we've seen over the last year has been a lot of engagement and hopefully education about these issues. Although many housing advocates have been working on these issues for a long time, I think a national awakening on the importance of so many different cross-sectional issues that affect the issues that we're talking about tonight, and zoning being one of them, land use, covenants that Karen mentioned. I think all of these things are part of our growing awareness, and of course, events like these that continue to raise awareness. So I think that's incumbent on all of us, and something we try to do at Desegregate Connecticut too through our event series. I mean, to your question about fair versus affordable housing, I mean, different people define that in different ways. There is no one single definition for either of those terms, really, even within individual towns. One of the things we documented in the zoning atlas was how differently each town defines affordable housing. Some towns would allow affordable housing projects, and they would define those as only projects that were developed by the town housing authority where only elderly people could live, or only people who worked in the school system or for the town could live. So some, again, I guess I would just say that there's not a clear, nobody seems to have a clear definition. I mean, for me, it's really about what's attainable. And we know that in Connecticut that too many families spend much more than they should in terms of their income on housing. So 1/6 of our population across the state is severely cost burdened, meaning they spend more than 50% of their income on housing. Of course, a lot of that burden falls on low income people, but there are many cost burdened and severely cost burdened people in what we would consider the middle income range. So I guess I would say we know that whatever we can quibble over how we define this, but if people can't afford housing because they're spending too much of their income on housing, then it's not attainable. It's not affordable. We need to provide so much more housing across a diverse range of housing types instead of what we are producing, which is really one size fits all, single family, large lot housing.
Karen, I'd like to hear your thoughts on if we're able to build and zone our way out of housing discrimination.
So, at the risk of being provocative, I would suggest that Connecticut is in violation of Federal Fair Housing Act, and that our continued segregation in the state and the continued reliance on the zoning structure that we have leaves us in a continual violation of some very fundamental anti-discrimination laws. And I feel like when you recognize that something illegal is happening, when you recognize that there are continued discriminatory practices, that we're continuing to move forward in a way that is keeping us as segregated as we've been since the passage of the Fair Housing Act, that it calls on us to take really urgent action. And so will we zone our way out of it? I think that the danger of putting just all our hopes into one thing like zoning is that we may pass a bill and then declare victory and sort of move on as though that solved it, and find that we actually haven't moved the needle far enough on some of the things. So I actually think we need to make some really significant changes to the way as a state that we address these issues and adopt models like a model you went to New Rochelle. I'll take us to New Jersey at the, staying in the tri-state area a little bit. And think about things like the fair share approach that New Jersey has taken on, which seeks to ensure that every municipality in the state of New Jersey carries its fair share of the amount of affordable housing that should be available in the state. And in Connecticut, we are short, estimates say at least 130,000 affordable units for families right now that, as Sarah was indicating, are paying far more than they can afford for their housing expenses. And I think to move us to close that gap for those 130,000 families, it's going to require us, yes, to do some of the zoning changes that were made in the past session and that have been proposed, but also to take on some bigger initiatives in order to get there. And again, I believe that we are called to do this if we are going to be in compliance with Fair Housing Act.
So let's talk a little bit about something that is present now, the hot housing market. We've heard a lot in the news about people from New York City and other states flocking to Connecticut, and how housing prices are on the rise. And depending on your perspective, that's a good thing or a bad thing, depending on who you are potentially. The state has a program to help lower income residents with down payments, but data show that those numbers of people who are able to take advantage of that are actually down during the pandemic. Karen, I'd like to pivot back to you for a second. Can you just talk a little bit about what you're seeing in New Haven as far as the hot housing market and what impact that's having on residents there?
Yeah, I think this COVID pandemic has been a shared experience that we have all been through, but the reality is that the experience has been very different and has impacted our neighbors very differently. And clearly those who are living at the lowest economic rung were hardest hit and are feeling this hot housing market that's related to people coming into the state. But in New Haven, it was a hot housing market that was developing pre-pandemic as well, with a real influx of higher end market rate luxury housing coming on board. And there's certainly a trend we've been watching is what that influx of new housing does to the rest of it in terms of how it impacts housing prices, but also how it continues to and deepens the segregation that we're experiencing. So as you develop most of that housing is coming in downtown New Haven, you find that we are building housing only for higher end people in a neighborhood, deepening the segregation patterns that were already existing. And so it's a place where we need to again take urgent action to ensure that when we're seeing that kind of influx of housing, that we are doing it in a way that is actually including housing at all income levels and ensuring that there's an affordable component in those developments.
I'd like to ask you, Jim, what are you seeing as far as the hot housing market and investing in underserved and disinvested communities, and also the ability to develop in higher income communities? Could you talk a little bit about how zoning is helping or hurting in that regard?
Well, first I'd like to say that I guess the question are we in a hot housing market? Is that definitive, right? In compared to what, right? Because if we're talking about residential construction, in 2019 we saw about 6,500 permits pulled for all types of housing. It was pretty much evenly split between single family and multifamily. Fast forward to 2020. we saw a reduction in the housing permits that were pulled. And by the way, housing permits are what the U.S. Census kind of uses to gauge housing productivity in our community. So in 2020, we saw something like 5,500 new permits pulled. And again, relatively evenly split between single family and multifamily. So, if we're talking about a hot housing market, what's that compared to? In 2009, prior to 2009, we were building upwards of 8,000 to 10,000 houses or units, I should say, a year. And go back to 2004, we were doing twice as much, closer to 20,000 units a year. So, Connecticut for a decade or more between 2009 and prior to the COVID spike in construction, was really building at recession levels. And we were building at about 3,000, 3,500 units a year. And quite frankly, in the past 4 or 5 years prior to the pandemic, the vast majority of that was multifamily. So what is zoning doing to the to impact the housing market? Well, it certainly is having an impact in so much that in the private sector, anyhow, there is and let me say this, let me preface what I'm about to say by saying this. Contrary to popular belief, developers are not litigious by nature, right? They follow the path of least resistance, right? And why is that, right? Because time is money. If a community does not welcome the development, whether it be multifamily or a subdivision of single family housing, the developer is less inclined to engage that community. And so I would certainly say that zoning has an impact, but so hasn't, supply side issues and other factors. So in short, yes, zoning is impacting where construction is occurring, both single family and multifamily.
The next question is for Sarah. Connecticut is one of the, Connecticut's one of the most segregated states in the country. Several reports, by several measures show. Your organization is called Desegregate Connecticut. You formerly were the chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission in Hartford, one of the most segregated places in Connecticut. Hartford also has a long ongoing chef order to desegregate Hartford schools. Cost $25,000 more for someone to attend a suburban school district nearby, or to move to a suburban school district nearby. A Brookings study from 2012 showed. And I guess I'm just really curious, if you look at Hartford's demographics, you'll see that a large share of its population or of its land is reserved for low-income tenants, extremely low-income tenants, in some neighborhoods up to 75%. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about how did Connecticut get so segregated, and what role did zoning play in that?
Yeah, well, I think Karen has, talked a little bit about the history. What we saw, Connecticut is a state that dates back hundreds of years. This is one of the first states. And we didn't have zoning until really the 1920s. So zoning was used in the 1920s as it really sort of swept. It was a sweeping national trend to have individual towns adopt zoning codes. And they were more or less related to or pretty simple single family zoning, industrial zoning, and so on. By the 1950s and 60s, you really saw a change in that these codes got much more restrictive. And there have been a few studies, and they're on our website, on our data page, data or reports page. So feel free to peruse those. But that where especially suburban towns got more and more restrictive when it came to their zoning rules. So things like minimum lot size. One of the things that the zoning atlas shows is that 81% of land with any residential housing on it in the state has at least a 1 acre minimum lot size requirement, meaning that you can't build a house unless you also have 1 acre of land. So that's the kind of thing that drives up prices in suburban areas, that puts homeownership or even rentals out of reach for many families, and that really changes the dynamic between cities, which have typically been much more permissive in terms of the kind of diverse housing types that they allow, versus some of the many towns who overwhelmingly have these huge lots and single family housing zoning only. The numbers don't lie. I mean, you can see it over time. You can click on the zoning atlas and look to see where there are minimum lot size requirements, look to see where there are unit size requirements, and kind of explore your town to see whether your town does that. One of the things that we're trying to do with this data is actually develop a zoning restrictiveness index, which will then reveal which of these factors, of these different kinds of zoning techniques or provisions lead to greater restrictiveness, lead to greater homogeneity, lead to higher incomes. And again, there's a ton of research that's been done on this across the country, but we'll be able to see in Connecticut for the first time all of these different zoning provisions and how they work now. Again, many of these more restrictive provisions were put in place in conjunction with what people call white flight out to the suburbs.
So let's talk a little bit about Section 8. This question is for Karen. Is the Section 8 program working? In theory, the choice vouchers are supposed to give people choices about where to live. Is it? Are wealthy towns able to keep voucher holders out? Are landlords turning down voucher holders despite state law saying it's illegal? If you look at state data, 55% of the state's nearly 35,000 voucher holders live in neighborhoods with concentrated poverty. That's higher than the national average and higher than 43 other states. What's driving that trend?
So the history of the government's involvement in housing started with public housing, where government funded the building of developments and things that people colloquially call the projects developed in many places. And round about the 60s, 70s, there was a shift in wanting to create an opportunity for families not to have to live only in the place where there is a public housing development, but to give them the opportunity to get federal assistance and use that in a way to move anywhere they may want to live. And so in the voucher program, a family selects a unit anywhere in the private market, finds a landlord that they want to rent to, and then the portion of that rent that they pay is such that they're never paying more than 30% of their income, and the voucher subsidizes the rest of it. So we would pay, if a family found a unit for $1,200 a month and they could pay $300 out of their income, then we would send the landlord a check for the other $900. And the idea was that this would free people to go and look anywhere to find a place to live. Well, when we look at we've got about 5,000 vouchers out in the community right now that we're subsidizing. And when you look at that, 80% of them are used in about 6 neighborhoods in the city of New Haven. And those 6 neighborhoods are the neighborhoods with the highest poverty and the greatest percentage of Black and Latino families. So the question, right, is the voucher program working to actually give families choice? Well, they have choice, and they're finding these units and they're renting in the communities. And they are free to go other places, but are they free to go other places? So there are laws on the books that say you cannot in Connecticut that says you can't discriminate against somebody because they're renting with Section 8. So we have that on the books. But do landlords find other ways not to want to rent to Section 8 recipients? Absolutely. Is the price point of units such that it's out of right? So we're not going to pay for an exorbitant rent. It's got to be a fair rent, a reasonable rent. These are your tax dollars being spent. Folks would have my job if they found out that I was subsidizing a family to live in a $4,000 a month unit. So another way that folks limit is by the price point that they charge for a unit that will limit families' choice. Families that are dependent on public transportation will find their choices are limited in terms of where they can go. Families that are comfortable in a particular community, they have resources, their job, their child's school, their medical providers, their social service network is tends to be in our urban centers. That will limit people. They'll want to stay in that community. And how welcoming another town feels. We tend to choose places to live where we feel like we're going to be comfortable. And if the other town offers a housing opportunity, but it doesn't feel welcoming to families, we find that they're not used. So this is not an artifact of Connecticut. We find across the country that the voucher program has not resulted in exercising at the kind of mobility that it was initially designed to do. But yet and still, it's a powerful tool. That if coupled with things like mobility counseling and coupled with real fair housing work to ensure that families aren't being discriminated against, and coupled with real building of affordable housing in more communities so it doesn't feel so isolating to move into a community where you will be the only family of color in that community and your children will be the only children to go to that school, the more we tackle some of those things, the more that voucher will really meet the goal of being a tool for mobility.
There was a bill in the legislature last year that you testified for. The state is facing a federal complaint on the ability to use vouchers in healthy houses, no matter where, which community, as well as in certain neighborhoods. Could you just describe really briefly what that bill would have done and why you think it didn't make it to the finish line?
Yeah, when I say I think that Connecticut is in violation of some aspects of the Fair Housing Act, there is a current pending complaint that's being reviewed by HUD right now as to whether we're in compliance, which relates to how the Section 8 program actually creates mobility because of the very things we're talking about and the barriers that are in place. One bill that we were very much behind sought to expand the jurisdiction of public housing authorities to really support the mobility feature and to allow for greater development. So right now is the New Haven Housing Authority, Elm City Communities. I'm limited to work within the 18 square miles of the city of New Haven. We do a tremendous amount of development. We would love to be able to place our vouchers in development projects in other towns, create affordable housing opportunity for families, and then facilitate people who've been on our wait list for years to be able to get leased up into another community. But that requires a change in state law, a change to open up more opportunities so housing authorities aren't limited just to their footprint. And we tried to get that moved for the past couple of sessions. We made progress this session in getting it voted out of committee. But what stops it? People's fear, people's fear about what it means for more development in suburban towns, what the fear of what a larger urban housing authority might be able to develop in another town and bring families into that town triggers people's concerns. And you'll hear things like local control and we don't want to lose our local control or give up. You'll hear thinly coded and not so thinly coded messaging about who's going to come, who's going to lease in those developments. There'll be connections made to if people come, that will be crime. It will be more kids in the schools and that will cost the towns. And those sorts of fears create difficulty sometimes for legislators to cast the vote that we need in order to get a bill moved forward. So it made it out of committee, never got called for a vote on the floor because we didn't hear enough of the voices. Because I'm a firm believer that the dominating voices are not necessarily the majority voices. But what you hear at the planning and zoning meeting in opposition, or what you hear at the state legislator meeting in opposition, can become very overwhelming because they're the voices that are loud and that are there and get perceived to be the majority because we're not hearing enough from the others. So building as you mentioned, educating, building the coalition and having that support, I think is what we'll continue to do as we move that forward.
So at this time, if you have questions, if you could put your index cards in the air and someone will come around. We have just one or two more questions before we start getting into those. Sarah, the legislature this year, gosh, time goes by so fast. This year did pass some reforms. Could you just talk a little bit about what you see those reforms doing for this conversation?
Yeah, so I dropped in the chat for those who are online a link to a page which links to the bill text and summarizes all of the different aspects of the bill that did pass, called Public Act 2129. We did see a lot of engagement on that particular bill throughout the last legislative session. Over 300 people submitted testimony in favor of it, outnumbering the opposite. The opposition to it, which we were really excited about. Sorry. That bill included, among other things, legalizing accessory dwelling units, capping parking mandates to 1 for studio and 1-bedroom apartments, 2 for 2 bedrooms or more. It actually included an affirmatively furthering fair housing component for zoning regulations. It eliminated towns' ability to have a minimum unit size. It specifically, for the first time, said that zoning regulations have to advance diverse housing types. It also required training for commissioners, something that the housing community had advocated for some time. And there's a number of other provisions that address procedural issues, fees that are charged, how towns pass through fees to multifamily housing developers, and so on. So Karen had mentioned, we can't declare victory just for that bill, and she's absolutely right. The coalition that I'm a part of through Desegregate Connecticut is working this year on new legislation that will hopefully build on that, even though it's a short session. The connections between land use, equity, and the environment, focusing on things like the minimum lot size reform and transit-oriented communities around train stations, which our research shows have been zoned almost in many communities for single-family large lot housing. You'd have some train stations with 2-acre minimum single-family housing zoning, which is just problematic from so many different levels, including the environmental level. So even if you are focused on environment instead of equity, if you're focused on equity instead of environment, there's arguments for each of these. And of course, the economic argument for greater housing supply generally. So, I mean, the reforms last year were really just one step, and you can see the arc of other states and how they've started with the kind of thing that we started with this year, and hopefully we'll build upon that as long as education efforts continue. So that's what we're working on with our group, and I'm happy to talk more about that later.
So at this point, we're going to start taking questions from the audience, and I want to be able to get to as many as possible. So I ask our panelists to try, because we do have a lot and we're running short on time. So the first one's for Karen. Can you say more about the significant steps the state still needs to address the housing inequities and the violations of the Fair Housing Act? What can the governor's office do if the legislature doesn't act? What can the legislature do? The attorney general's office? What other entities should be involved, and what can happen? What can citizens do? I assume you're suggesting the need for a combination of a carrot and stick approach. What do you recommend for getting things across the finish line?
Great. And I got,
sorry, that's a lot.
with the right, exactly, with the caveat to be brief, right? So I think we've got to continue to build the coalition of the willing, and work to create more and more advocates for this work, and speak out and challenge the assumptions that undergird this work, right? Challenge the notions that there are good and bad neighborhoods. We hear that all the time. Challenge that, right? Push through that. It was fun driving up here. I'm a mom of a student who was at University of Hartford, and I love this, and I mean this with no disparagement to this university. But my family laughed when we first were bringing my son to the school, and they gave the university gives directions, and the directions specifically say, do not use your GPS. Follow these directions. And we follow the directions, and it loops you around a lovely route that brings you through West Hartford and gets to the campus. Well, we know this area quite well. And so we know, well, this is not the direct way for where we were coming from. It's not the direct way, but it's a route that keeps you from coming up Albany Avenue and through the city of Hartford. We can all draw conclusions about that. But as we think about how we think about and approach this work. I think it's incumbent on all of us to think about the assumptions we make and what we are comfortable with and why we're comfortable with things and why we accept that certain neighborhoods look certain ways and other neighborhoods don't, and challenge it. I think we do have to organize and push some things through at the state level around the fair share bill is a great one. I'd encourage you to get behind our Public Housing Authority jurisdiction bill as we move forward, because we've had something on the books. We've had something called 8-30G on the books for years that has said that each town has to get to a level of affordability. And we see that has not moved us, because we need both a goal and a goal that gets us to the number I put out there of 130,000 units. We need a goal and a time frame to get there. We think we can get there in the next 10 years with some aggressive action. And we need it to not just be a please do this, but we need it to be accompanied by the push. And bills like fair share actually tie the push to that as well. Giving tools like the federal subsidy is an incredibly powerful tool to make housing affordable and deeply affordable. We shouldn't constrain that to only being used in cities. That's why it's important that we do the PHA the Public Housing Authority jurisdiction bill, because it allows us to use that powerful subsidy tool, our federal tax dollars, in all of the cities and towns, all of the communities in our state. So I think we need to push on legislative change at that rate as well. But speak up, right? Make it known that you want your communities to be more diverse. Make it known that you find it unacceptable that certain communities are historically and continue to be under-resourced while others are flourishing. Make it known that you want young people to go to school and diverse schools and have friends and experiences of all different backgrounds. Be the advocate for that, so that your voices can outnumber those that will definitely be the not in my backyard voices. We need a lot of yes in my backyard voices. We need to be YIMBYs and not NIMBYs around this.
So Jim, I'm gonna combine 3 questions here for you. The first is 830G working? That in theory is supposed to help developers build in recalcitrant towns. The second is, what role does property taxes play in keeping housing affordable when you're considering whether something will remain in people's price points? And then the legislature created an opt-out provision for the ADUs. And do you see development stalling in communities now? What are you seeing sort of that on the ground?
I'll answer the last question first. I think it might be a little too soon to really make that judgment call pertaining to ADUs. I personally haven't heard of any municipalities as of yet opting out, and maybe there are, but I'm not familiar with them. So I think the jury's still out on that. I can tell you that from a private developer perspective, that there has been some interest. I've fielded phone calls from my members who have made inquiries. I know that the real estate, the realtor community has had some real interest in exploring opportunities with ADUs. So again, jury's still out. And I apologize. The other questions were.
Is 830G working, and the role that property taxes are playing in keeping homeownership and people's reach?
Okay, so 830G, is it working? Yes and no, I would say, and that's a convoluted question or answer to a difficult question. Certainly it's being utilized, and it's being utilized in 2 different capacities, right? There's the typical 830G, and then there's what's referred to in the community as a friendly 830G. So a friendly 830G, for those who may not know, is a scenario in which the town is asking the developer to go ahead and engage in an 830G development. And you ask, like, why does that happen, right? It's because the town, in essence, doesn't have the political fortitude to develop affordable housing in a public manner, in a way that's a conversation amongst the public. And so they ask developers to engage in a friendly 830G that we know will not be strongly litigated by the municipality, and thereby it will come to fruition and be developed. As far as property taxes and how that impacts construction, of course it does, right? Builders factor in costs just like any other business, and property taxes are one of those elements that builders will consider for sure.
The next question is for Sarah. I'm going to merge two questions. The state gives towns the authority to do zoning. Why hasn't, if there's acknowledgement that there's a problem, why hasn't the state decided to step in? Maybe talk a little bit about your journey to make some changes in the legislature, as well as would some of these challenges be mitigated if there was less autonomy each town has and structure some more oversight? What would that look like?
Yeah, so it's important to note that every state in the country has enabling legislation for towns that gives towns zoning powers, but that those zoning powers rest with the state. So when you do hear some of this language about local control, it's really a myth. And there's an op-ed that a law professor wrote about this topic at the height of the debate over the reforms this last legislative session, really saying that this idea of local control is really a myth, because it's the states that tell localities exactly what kind of zoning powers they can use and how they can exercise those powers. So the state is already involved in zoning because of that. The state already sets floors and caps and benchmarks and standards. And so anything that we do at the state level is very consistent with 100 years of zoning, because zoning only emerged after the state passed an enabling act that allowed towns to do that, to zone. So I think that's an important point on that front. And then your second question was, you said tied to that?
Yeah, tie it to the ability for what would state oversight look like to sort of help remediate this?
Yeah, so there are many other states that have really moved the ball forward when it comes to state level action that helps guide towns to have certain results. And we've seen huge changes and development for more affordable housing in places where people can afford and in configurations that people can afford. So just recently, and again, we summarize these on our website, it's called Other States, but California has recently just passed reforms at the state level, enabling essentially duplexes on any lot. And this is a few years after, in 2016, they legalized accessory apartments without the opt-out, and saw an 11-fold increase in accessory apartments across the state in 3 years. So in 2016, there were X number of permits. In 2019, there were 11X number of accessory apartment permits. So Connecticut, we've started that process with the legislation that was just passed, and there's so much opportunity to build those. We hope to see those happen here. Massachusetts, just last year on a bipartisan basis, passed legislation at the state level about MBTA stations. And what it said there was that essentially within a reasonable radius of these train stations, towns had to zone for 15 units per acre. And that's a very doable amount, even in historic Boston suburbs and historic Boston. We think that Connecticut is ready for that kind of reform. And again, it was almost unanimous bipartisan. A Republican governor championed these reforms. So we're hopeful that people start to see zoning as really a win-win-win for everybody. Vermont is another state that has enacted minimum lot size reforms. Again, the other thing that I think we mentioned, what they say is that for an eighth that people can subdivide land up to an eighth of an acre if it is served by municipal water and sewer. I'm not sure we'll get to that point yet here, but you can see that even some of our neighboring states are doing a lot more on this front. And that's why you see so much construction in those states. I mean, Jim has the stats as well as anybody, but Connecticut has been dead last in building permits throughout the pandemic and probably many years before that as well. We just don't build enough housing here, and that's what's leading to our affordability crisis. So other states are models. There are lots of different ways to do this, but what we've seen work in other states are clear rules that tell developers, you can build this here in these locations with these rules, and 10% affordability requirement, 20% affordability requirement. So we get those deeply affordable units that we desperately need, but to allow the clear rules to kind of unfold. And that's where I think the role of the state can be really helpful in addressing this across town boundaries.
Karen, this question is for you. If you do owner occupied affordable housing development, how do you keep those properties affordable? Is that a feasible model? Or when the original owners sell, do you just have to build more affordable housing to replace that, or does it stay affordable? As well as there was a question about gentrification I'd like to pose to you as well. How does affordable housing relate to gentrification? And what does building more housing potentially do?
So on the home ownership models, I mean, if you have underlying deed restriction, you can control the use of that for that current property owner, but also for as the property turns over. And that's a model we've used on affordable home ownership that we have developed as a housing authority, so that we ensure that that property continues to be affordable down the road. You can couple that with other subsidy and assistance to make sure that the mortgage is affordable to the family, and it's a great model. And more of that, I think, is what's needed to get some more homeownership opportunities. So I think the trick when I think about the urban investment, it's right. We want energy on both prongs. We want energy on getting affordable housing opportunities in those communities that have so successfully closed the door to it for hundreds of years now. So we want to create opportunities of affordable housing in suburban communities, but we also don't want to do it at the expense of investment in the city core, the cities that have historically provided that and been so under-resourced. So we want to see an investment in our cities as well. And the redevelopment work we've been doing in New Haven has been focused on redeveloping those communities that have carried the affordable housing for the region for years, but also have been very underinvested. The trick in the urban redevelopment is how to do that in ways that is not gentrification. It's not creating improved housing stock and improved community for some new community that doesn't include those who are already there. And it's a lot of the concern that we'll hear from advocates and the pushback when a new development is proposed in New Haven, particularly a market rate developer, or you hear it a lot with investors who are buying up a lot of the housing stock and changing it. And I think there's some potential tools around models like buy the block, where you get a municipal investor, a city or a town or a nonprofit developer to buy up an area in order to rehab it and keep it affordable and again, deed restricted is a model. I think affordability requirements through inclusionary zoning, and that is another way to push back against that. And again, changing our assumptions about what it means to redevelop for the folks who are already there will need to be a part of our conversation, so that investment in urban centers doesn't mean displacement of families who've been there.
Jim, could you talk about, there's a question here for you about what solutions to the racial gap in home ownership, what can be done in that regard? And there's another question here about what role land banks, CHFA, and others play in making certain communities more desirable to build in.
Those questions, I would actually probably defer to Karen and Sarah to answer the first question. But I do want to add to this. I heard both Karen and Sarah mention mandatory inclusionary zoning. I just want to caution folks about mandatory inclusionary zoning, right? It by itself, it doesn't have a very good track record, point blank. There are case studies across the country pertaining to mandatory inclusionary zoning. But if you couple mandatory inclusionary zoning with the appropriate incentives for developers to build that mandatory inclusionary zoning, such as density bonuses, parking bonuses, et cetera, then you have a viable option, right? But at the end of the day, development has to be such that if we're talking about the private sector, that it makes sense for them to be able to build it. They have lenders, they have investors, they need an ROI that works. So, and I apologize, the last part of the question, I probably spoke too long. Go ahead. I apologize.
When I talked about sort of shifting frames and redefining how we think about things, I think we think about government subsidy and immediately our thoughts go to low income people, and value judgments often get us associated with that, and worthiness and all sorts of things get associated. And it's a way, and it's rooted in real anti-poverty and classism that gets baked into a lot of what we do, in a way that allows us not to see all of the ways that government subsidizes so many other things that we benefit from. The way in which middle class housing is government subsidized, the way in which very expensive housing is federally subsidized through your mortgage interest deduction and things. There are many things that the government subsidizes that we, if we benefit from them at the middle to wealthy class, we don't think of in the same disparaging way that too many people think about government subsidy that when it's benefiting those at the lower income end. And I say that because when I talk about inclusionary zoning, it is coupled with incentives and assistance, and it's a subsidy in a way, just as so many of the other things that we want to see happen, we will partner it with things that make it happen. And so my model of inclusionary zoning is, what is that sweet spot that doesn't unduly enrich the developer, and doesn't unduly burden the developer, or unfairly enrich the developer and unduly burden the developer, and gets the goal that we want, which is a mixed income kind of development, because the most vibrant communities are those that have a range of people living together in mixed income. Now, your question though was what?
I've been reading through so many questions. I forget which one.
The first, you would want me to answer the first part of it, and I just don't remember what the first part was.
I would defer to Jack.
Let's just move on to the next question. So this question is for Sarah. When we define affordable housing, why do we exclude affordable rentals, including ADUs, just because they aren't built after 1990? Could you just talk a little bit about how the state defines affordable, and whether that definition is too narrow or too broad?
I think that the audience member is asking specifically about the statute referred to as 8-30G, which sets that 10% minimum affordable housing requirement and has very particular definitions in state law. We actually have not, as a coalition, addressed that particular issue. I will say that one of the things that we advocated for in this session was that if an accessory apartment was created, that it would not count towards the denominator of units from which the 10% was drawn from. But if it was deed restricted affordable, it will now count towards the numerator. So in other words, it will help towns achieve their goals, but it won't hurt towns as more and more homeowners hopefully put accessory apartments on their homes. And by the way, for anybody listening in the audience, the accessory apartment legislation, unless your town has started that opt-out process, which by the way, we're monitoring, and if you're on our mailing list, you'll get an individual email if we even hear an inkling about the town trying to do that. You can petition to your town right now to get an accessory apartment unit. So call Jim up, ask him for a builder, and go pull those permits right now. And you won't hurt your town, and it's achieving the 10% under 830G. But you could help it if you actually do deed restricted affordable. I will return to Jim's point that that law has had various problematic elements. I think sometimes setting out benchmarks like that, it can be hard for people to kind of understand how to get to those goals. And so, for our coalition, for the time being anyway, we're kind of accepting 830G as the law on the books, and maybe we'll make some modest changes to it, but there is a lot of reluctance to change it significantly. So anything that we're doing is really separate and apart from that, and trying to again focus on that clear set of rules that everybody can follow and everybody can satisfy their everybody's expectations in terms of what gets built in a community.
So the last question I'm going to ask for you, Karen, there's a lot of people who struggle paycheck to paycheck. There's a question here. Is there any innovative program to help with security deposits if I don't have one? Currently, a landlord can legally only mail my security deposit to my new next address. I believe they're talking about Unite CT maybe. Could you just talk sort of broadly about the availability of security deposits for people who don't necessarily have, that lump sum payment that they might need?
Yeah, I put this in the category of all of the ways in which we make it really hard for people to be low income, and the many barriers that we have to remove. So, when we're leasing people up, we don't charge security deposit. We don't do credit check and things, because it's sort of understood that if you've been living in a place without affordable housing, your credit's probably shot, and you probably don't have thousands of dollars saved up for that. But that's not a universally practiced approach to housing, and I think it's a place for some advocacy. It is a place that I think, as we think about this moment we're in right now in the pandemic recovery and all of the money that has come into this state, it is a place I think to advocate for at the local level, as each of your cities and towns is thinking about how to spend that money. That helping people stabilize their housing includes paying that arrearage that Unite CT is helping with, but it also includes thinking about things like how do you get people into safe and decent housing. Having programs that help pay security deposit, I think, is a great use of that kind of money, and I would encourage people to advocate for that, because we don't have nearly enough resource for that assistance in the state.
I want to thank everyone for attending both in person and virtually. Excuse me. Please share with others what you have learned today and during this program. Watch your email for messaging and providing with links to the additional reading materials and the organizations who are doing important work around this area. Please join us for the next 2 sessions. The next is on November 10th. Again, it's on education. And the last one will be on December 8th on regionalization.